Hi everyone, Neil Snape here, and I'm going to show you how to do a beauty picture in Lightroom with a creative thought process that I use every time. It's really quite simple. There's a logical fashion to doing it. It's actually quite fun. Since last time I made the tutorials, I've actually gone up to Adobe Creative Cloud, which is a great deal because it includes Photoshop CC and Lightroom CC. As you'll find that on the left side I have a picture I've already processed that way. That is a RAW, that is not a photoshopped image, and that's taken off of the image that's on the right, which is the original with absolutely no corrections. It's a little bit light, maybe a little bit overexposed, but it gives you a good base and gives you an idea of what it looks like before you start doing anything in Lightroom. So let's just take this back to the grid mode, and I'm going to select only the virtual copy that I have made, and I will press D to take us into the develop mode. So the first things I always do when I start with an image is look at the color temperature. So I start off in the first panel and from the top to the bottom. I'm going to do this. I'm going to just see if the colors were cool on a picture like this with a warm base already. It wouldn't make too much sense. You could make the whites cool, but I don't think you'd want to take the yellows and the warm colors out of the chocolate. So I'll take a look and see what happens if I make it quite a bit brighter in the yellows, in the tones. Now, to make sure there's not too much in the way of greens, I can actually even put in a little bit of magenta, because when I used to do still life, I've actually shot chocolate for advertising, and we always had to add a little bit of magenta in the pictures, whether or not it was film or digital, because chocolate just needs a little bit of magenta. So I'm going to just crop the image before I get too long, and I'm going to uncheck the lock button so that it doesn't constrain to the original format, and I want to keep it a fairly wide page. So let's just say if it was going for a printed page, I might want to include just a little bit more underneath the chin so there's a little bit of space. That's all there is to it. If I press R again or click on the button, it will crop it to where it was. Now let's go back to the first panel and take a look at exposure. If I make the exposure any lighter, it'll start to get very, very bright, and to my eye, it's not really what I want. I want it darker, and yet I don't want the blacks to go too dark. So I'm going to take a look at around here. Then I'm kind of wondering with contrast if I add more contrast, it'll increase both saturation and the darks. So that's looking pretty good. And I'm just going to keep going with that one. Now, since I've already changed the color temperature and the tint, I can also see that I can increase slightly already the saturation. It's something you don't normally do in pictures because you'll have too much color in the skin tone. Yet this picture is done on purpose to have a lot of color, so you can actually get by with a little bit more saturation. I took up the vibrance just slightly. Now, if I really want to add color in here, there are many ways of doing that. Before I go on with the highlight, shadows, whites and blacks on the image, I will go down to my split toning, and I will actually add some reds into the shadows. Now the way you do that is just to quickly play with the saturation slider, and you will find that where and how much color is going to be added. Then you'll choose your color after. If you have zero saturation, that's the same as not having anything. No matter where you move the slider to, it won't add any color until you actually add some saturation into it. And I think that looks pretty good. I don't know if I want a little bit more yellow green, and I have to be careful not to add too much. I'll take that down, and now I'll just do just the opposite on the highlights. I turn up the saturation to find out where the colors are going to live, and then I know I want to add in a little bit more blue. So I don't want it to go too magenta, and I don't want it to be too green. So it's going to be somewhere in around there. And then I'm going to take the saturation back down again so it's reasonable. So all I'm doing is adding a little bit of blueness into the highlights, the whites. So around the lips and a little bit of the powder. And then there's an actual bias slider, which is called balance, but it's actually, it's going to put in more emphasis if I go to the left into the shadows. And if I want it to affect more of the highlights, I actually take the slider over to the other side, and then it doesn't affect as much the shadows and it's only highlights. So you just play with it visually until you find the right point. And for me, it's right about there, so a little bit more on the shadow side. Then I will just slightly tweak the saturation a little bit. It's looking pretty good. Now, we'll go back to the first panel, the basic panel. Command 1 will take you there. Or just click on the basic panel itself. And now I'm going to start to play with the highlights. Now I don't want them to blow out, so I'm actually going to take them down a little bit. And then you can see the detail come back into the image. And yet I don't want it to go too flat, so I have to be careful where exactly I'm going to do that. It's important that you start on the basic panel, because later you will go to the tone curves. But everything that you do in the first panel actually are the important settings, and the ones you do in tone curves are applied after everything in the basic panel. That's why you need to start there. So I don't want to really make the more shadow detail. I actually want to take it down so it's quite dark. So I'm just going to take it down just a little bit. Whites. I still feel that they should have put the whites and the blacks immediately after highlights and shadows. But these are actually the clipping points for those sliders. So I'm going to take that one down to there. And the blacks, I'm just going to see what happens. I don't want to lose too much color because they'll go quite dark. And that's all there is to it. Clarity, I used to use a lot of clarity. These days I don't use much clarity at all, because as you can see, it's in mid-tones. It's actually a mid-tone contrast control, and in this case it makes it look sharper, but it also makes it look quite dirty in the skin tones. So when you have pure skin tones and the makeup's well done and the subject has good skin, you don't want to add much in the way of clarity. The way you use clarity now, the best way, is to actually use a brush and apply it locally. So I'll go off to the actual tone curves and I'll play with that just a little bit. And you can see if I go take it down a little bit, the whites get a little bit too bluish, and that's because we added some split toning. I'll take that one back up. That's about right. Often I use the sliders. These are dividers, so that's at the start point or the range controller. If I turn it up to 90%, it means that it affects things at 90% and above. If you use your mouse and you roll it over top of the graph itself, you will see the areas that are affected by lighter gray than the background zone. So if you move your slider back in again, you'll see that that becomes a lot larger when you're towards the midpoint. When you move it out, then it's only the very bright whites. And I usually do the same thing for the darks before I start moving them about. And in this case, it's the darks then that are affected in the ranges that are shown above. I don't want to get too dark, and also I want to do, maybe I'll even take those up a little bit, and that way I can take only the blacks. So that'll really increase the volume or the amount of dimension in the picture by just the blacks. And you can see that if I take this one up, I can actually shape the image by using those controls. There is a curves panel, by the way, in Lightroom. You just click on this little button and it will take you to curves if you're more familiar with curves from Photoshop. I use them when I have to, but I still like the sliders. Some people do, some people don't. Now, we'll go off to the next panel and we're going to see where the reds live just by changing it really quickly. So you can see there's a little bit in the lips, around the eyes. There's some components of red. And I'm just going to see what I'm going to do with it. Do I want it darker? Do I want it lighter? That's the joy of Lightroom. I'm just going to play with it until you find what you think is good. I don't mind it when it's, should I desaturate? Okay, let's desaturate a little bit. And then should we make it go a little bit more yellow? Yes. That'll take away the local contrast in the reds. Now, oranges. Lots and lots and lots of orange. Should we make it brighter, darker, brighter, darker, brighter, darker? I would say a little bit darker, but not to make it look like she's got a tan. I'm going to take this down. And I might even make it a try like this. The way that you can save all your settings into a little tiny file is to press Command N to make a snapshot. And you say create. You can rename it. And it will save it as a little file, and you can always go back to exactly that point. Because what I'm going to do right now is press Command 1 and go back to my exposure. We're already down a minus 0.8, but I'm going to see what happens if I go down, go back to my color panel, and take those oranges up. And just to see visually what happens if I take oranges way up by themselves, maybe a little bit up in the reds, and see how much yellow is in there. Yeah, it's about right. So I could do another snapshot at that point, and you can see before and after. And that would take me right there. I think I'll stick with the first one though. So let's go back to where we were, and I'm going to make the oranges a little bit brighter, and I'm going to take those yellows and just play with those. Then I see everything else. I don't think there's much in the way of greens in here. If you double click on the word green, take it back to 0 or luminance or the middle of the slider, it's all the same. Right. There are no aquas, blues. There might be some purple, so I just take the slider. Doesn't do anything. Same thing, magenta. Is there any? Not that I can see, so I double click on it. It takes me back there. Now, since I liked the image a little bit darker, I'm still going to continue with taking it down a little bit. And that's about right for me. You don't want to get too much contrast, otherwise the chocolates will go black, because I can always shape this with the brush tool later. That's about everything that you need to do overall in this image, other than I will show you some of the things I would like to do is to make this darker here, so it has less of a space. I will probably brighten here in the eyes, in the center, darken here on the outsides. I will make a little bit more depth underneath with the shadow there, burn this a little bit, but I will lighten in the shadows here and see what happens. So let's go do that now. You just press K for the brush tool, and we're going to start off by setting the effect to contrast first. Let's see what happens if I try a little bit more contrast here. And sure enough, it works quite well. Well, that way it's going to push the lights up a little bit lighter. And the dark's a little bit darker. Now, this zone here, we're going to build a new one. And I'm going to change the contrast, but I'm going to take the exposure down. As soon as I did that, it changed it to custom because I have multiple settings in there. I'll take the shadows down and take the highlights down. And it's not checked to auto. I've got a magic mouse, so I actually just turn the horizontal wheel up and off it goes. And to make it a little bit softer, since I painted over there, I'm actually going to take the clarity down, and it's going to make it fade away so you don't see much at all. Perfect. Now, let's build a new brush, and we're going to take exposure up a little bit. It always remembers your last used settings, so last time you used 0.10. Draw there, draw there. I'm not seeing much effect, so I'm actually going to take it up higher than that. Very good. I'm going to lighten just there a little bit. I'm going to make it smaller on the top of the eye. And I think that's about it. Usually I draw a little bit there, but it's already white. Ah, that was good. And I'm just going to lighten up those for the details that are on the sides. And we're done. We'll make one more brush, at least one, but this one we're going to add in that magic clarity. Now, Clarity, you have to be really careful because it can make an image look very fake very fast. When Lightroom first came out, everybody went crazy, and all the pictures from years ago, they all had way too much clarity. Capture One does a lot better job in as far as the later versions of clarity. Lightroom, they still haven't changed it. So we have to use it for what it is, and that means with light hand. Now, what I would like to do is add a ton of texture in the sides here. So that's what I'm doing. A little bit more. Might add more here, but I'm not sure it's going to work. Let's see. Yes, it did. And I think we're about. And we'll do a side-by-side comparison of both. Except my second one now, I'm going to have to go to develop. Make sure that they're not on auto sync, so I turn that off. And I'll hit reset, so it'll reset the one in the front. Then we go back to see for compare, and now you can see the differences between before and after, and I think you'll find that it's much better with the Lightroom edited version. Without even going to Photoshop, you can find yourself having a lot of fun playing with the images and getting excellent results without even going to Photoshop. Photoshop is great for moving around pixels or temporary items because Lightroom is quite slow at the way it actually pushes pixels around. In other words, cloning of pixels or moving them. Let's say, for instance, the little hairs that are on the bottom lip that have a little bit of powder and white, those things, they're a lot faster to take them out in Photoshop, if not only possible in Photoshop, as Lightroom's not made for pushing pixels around very much. It does have a clone tool, but it's not efficient. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you again. So subscribe to my channel. I'll try to get more videos up, and not only Lightroom, but as well as Capture One. See you soon. Thanks.